Tocqueville on Democratic Despotism, Lecture 1. In the previous Tocqueville lectures, I talked about Tocqueville's understanding of individualism as an inherent tendency of democracy, democratic societies, because they're characterized by a broad equality of rights, and along with that, an array of opportunities and social mobility makes it such that there's a natural tendency in democratic societies for people to become, primarily focused on themselves, their private lives, their family, their friends, their hobbies. So they sort of isolate themselves from the broader society, live in a kind of bubble, and do not take an active concern for the broader common good. That is something that is possible in any democratic society. But Tocqueville had gone on to argue that it was that individualism had in fact been defeated, had been stopped in the United States, primarily because of the existence of free local self-government and civil associations, whereby Americans acquire the habit of working together with their fellow citizens to serve broader public needs or the common good, so to keep them as active citizens. Now, in these readings on democratic despotism, we read about Tocqueville's fear that there is a particular kind of despotism that is possible in democratic countries. And he talks about what kind of despotism this is, what makes it possible, and what must be done to combat it. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the character of this despotism and what brings it about. And this is something that Tocqueville fears. Now, Tocqueville is projecting here. He's thinking about what the future of a democratic society could hold for it. And in saying that there is a possibility of despotism, you have to understand something of what he means by despotism. Now, the word despotism comes from a Greek word that meant the master of a slave. And so despotic government is usually understood as something like absolute government, where there is one person or group of people that have absolute authority over the society as a whole and who do not govern with the common good in mind. But the lasting association is that despotism is a word for unfree government. In a despotic society, most people are not free. And what makes Tocqueville interesting here is that there's a particular kind of unfreedom that Tocqueville has in mind here. He's not warning about the development of tyrannically violent and brutal societies, but in fact, the kind of despotism that is possible in a democratic society is one that would be actually relatively peaceful and mild, but it would be nonetheless a society where most people, even though they aren't violently harassed by the authorities, nonetheless are not free. And so he's writing these chapters to warn against this, to try to sort of raise the alarm, so that as societies become more equal and more democratic, this tendency towards this particular kind of democratic despotism is stopped from happening. So the brief way of putting it would be to say that Tocqueville is arguing that social and political equality tend to make people, citizens broadly, want to have a centralized and extremely large and active government. With the problem being is that this brings about a situation where the government becomes more and more active in providing for everything, and individual citizens become more and more passive and dependent upon the government, so that people sort of lose the willingness and the ability to govern themselves. They lose the willingness and ability to take responsibility for their own affairs and to work with one another, and instead become more like dependent children. Right? That's why the image that Tocqueville has in mind is not a slave master lording over a bunch of slaves, but really something more like a nanny that is taking care of all the aspects of the lives of a bunch of children. So really the concern here is that democratic society will lead democratic peoples to become sort of big herds of dependent sheep. And that's what he wants to prevent. So, to begin with, then, what this means for Tocqueville is there's a kind of a permanent tension in democratic society between the desire for freedom, on the other hand, and the desire for security and dependence, on the other. Now, he notes, and this is Volume 2, Part 4, Chapter 1, which begins at the bottom of page 297. Tocqueville notes that in democratic societies, there is a natural tendency for people to want to have free institutions. That is to say, the natural inclination of people is to say, hey, I want to live under institutions that I have a say in, democratic institutions. As he says at the beginning of that chapter, equality, which makes men independent of each other, makes them acquire the habit and the taste for following in their own actions only their own will. This complete independence, which they enjoy continually in relation to their equals and in their in the habitual conduct of their private life, disposes them to look upon all authority with a dissatisfied eye, and soon inspires in them the idea and the love of political liberty. So, in other words, to put it kind of simply, in a democratic society, for the most part, you are in charge of your own life, right? You can choose your job, you can choose your spouse, you can choose your friends, you can choose where you live. There's lots and lots of individual choice. And you're in charge. By the time you're an adult, pretty much you're in charge. And what he's saying here is the fact that we are in charge, that we follow our own will in our private affairs, means that there's a natural tendency in democratic societies for people to say, hey, I want to have a say in the government too. Right? That since I'm in charge of my private life, I want to have a voice in the government too. I want to be free there too. So it's not that democratic society obviously is hostile to liberty. In fact, the natural tendency is to want liberty. The problem is that there are these other tendencies in democratic society that work against that. And that's what he talks about in chapters 2 and 3 of Volume 2, Part 4. And these are the chapters that begin on page 298 and go through page 304. And in brief, what he's talking about in these chapters is that even though there's a desire for freedom, there's also a tendency that sort of towards two things. On the one hand, he thinks it is natural in a democratic society to want to consolidate the powers of government into a single body. That is, there's a natural tendency towards centralizing authority in democratic society. And that should already, since you've been reading Tocqueville, that should already raise some alarm bells, because remember, for Tocqueville, part of the real freedom that people enjoy in democratic society comes about because there is decentralized power, right? It's because of decentralization that local governments can govern themselves. So instead of all power being consolidated in the capital city, and in the national government, power is decentralized in such a way that at the local level, people can participate. But he thinks there's a natural tendency in democracy towards centralizing governmental power. And not only is there a tendency towards centralizing governmental power, but there's also a tendency to want to expand governmental power. So in other words, at the same time that there's a tendency to want to you might say, narrow who actually holds governmental power, to centralize everything, you want to make the government responsible for more and more things. And it's the combination of these two factors that is so deadly. A centralized government responsible for more and more things over time. So it's the tendency towards centralization and expansion of governmental power that will pave the way to democratic despotism, to the particular kind of unfreedom that exists in democratic and equal societies. So then obviously the natural question is, why does Tocqueville think that there's a natural tendency towards centralization and expansion of governmental power? And here I'll just mention a few things that come from these chapters. So for example, in chapter 2, Tocqueville says that democratic equality naturally leads to a desire for uniformity in society. Um, and this, he talks about this on page 299 in the middle paragraphs in talking about uniform legislation. So here, what he has in mind is this notion that in a democratic society, since we're all supposed to be equal, part of what it means to be equal is that we're all subject to the same rules, right? Nobody should have any special privileges or anything like that. Everybody should be subject to the same laws. And although he doesn't make it quite as clear as it could be, um, the desire for uniformity in legislation leads to centralizing governmental power. And this is obvious once you think about it. When you have decentralized government, remember administrative decentralization that we talked about earlier in the course. When you have administrative decentralization so that localities can make decisions for themselves, that leads to variety. You don't get uniformity, right? You won't. So, for example, if each county gets to decide on its own school curriculum or something like that, you're not going to end up with identical curricula everywhere. Different places are going to do things differently, right? That's just the essence of decentralization. So on the one hand, decentralization leads to a lack of uniformity, but he thinks the fact that we're all equal and all have equal rights makes Democrats want to have uniform legislation. We should all be subject to the same rules. But the only way to make everybody subject to the same rules is to have one institution that makes the rules for everyone, right? So if you want uniformity, you need administrative centralization. And I can give you a few examples here. I mean, one clear one would be with, sort of elementary, and high school education. That there was a time when the federal government really was not involved at all in the provision of education. That was left up to states and to school districts and things like that. And in many ways, it still is. But as you all might know, right around the turn of the millennium, with the No Child Left Behind Act, you had the development of a battery of tests and an establishment of national standards. And now all schools are subject to certain national standards. And one of the reasons for this, one of the arguments was leaving education up to the individual states and school districts has led to an extremely wide variety of outcomes. Some states do a good job of educating their kids. Some states do a worse job educating kids. But really, everybody should receive a good education. Everybody should have opportunity. And so in order to make sure that everybody has an opportunity, we're going to make a common set of rules that everybody is subject to. And you do that by passing a federal law such that part of education policy has now been centralized in the hands of the federal government. It has much more say over local governments than it did before. And it was precisely out of a desire for a kind of uniformity. The idea is there are certain standards of education that we want every school to meet. And we're not going to leave it up to individual schools to define their own standards. We're going to set uniform standards for them to meet. So that desire for a kind of uniformity in educational quality leads to a centralization of control over educational policy. And this is what Tocqueville's talking about. If we're all equal, we should all be subject to the same rules. The only way for us all to be subject to the same rules is for all of us to be subject to the same governmental body that makes rules for all of us. That's centralization, right? And he also notes that there's a way in which having decentralized power, he thinks, can seem kind of strange to democratic peoples, because if we form one people, he thinks it only makes sense for one people to be under one government, right? So the fact of having a multitude of governments that you're subject to, state, local, and national, he thinks there's a way in which that just kind of goes against the grain of a democratic society where you have sort of one population. That if there's one we the people should have one government. So he thinks that there's just a way in which democratic equality naturally leads to centralization. And this is sort of contrary to, say, aristocratic society or feudal society, which was highly decentralized, right? So democratic equality makes people want uniformity, which leads to centralization. But now, alongside the tendency towards centralization, there's also the tendency towards expanding the powers of government. And that's what he talks about in chapter 3. He gives multiple reasons, but I'm only going to go through a few of them. So, obviously, the big one, and he talks about this in chapter 3, say pages 301, 302, is you've got individualism, right? You have the fact that people in democratic societies tend to be preoccupied with their own affairs, that's the natural tendency of things. And that means if people are preoccupied with their own private affairs, somebody else is going to have to run government and is going to have to be responsible for all the things that people on their own cannot take care of. So if you're always focusing just on your own private pursuits, basically the idea is you're going to need a pretty substantial government in order to take care of all the stuff that you can't, right? So the schools, the parks, the roads, all the various aspects of society. So individualism, by making people turn towards their own private lives, at the same time makes them need an active government. Since they aren't governing themselves, they need a government to take care of those things, right? So I'm just going to look after my own business. Let the state take care of the broader societal good. Right. And he also notes, because with individualism and all that, that people oftentimes in democratic societies, they have to support themselves, so they don't have a lot of time, right, and resources to get involved in government. So the focus on private life creates a need for an active government in a democratic society. He also notes on page 302, and you can also look in the footnote, that because democratic societies tend to have quite a bit of sort of economic activity, right, and people have economic opportunities, and people hope to move up the social ladder, right, to try to find opportunities and take them to better their lot. Because you have that in democratic society, because democratic societies tend to have a sizable middle class, that means that people in democratic societies really want law and order. That they're very anxious to make sure that they are secure, that their property is secure, and they are aware that they're not able single-handedly to secure themselves, right? You need police, and you need the military, and you need a working legal system and all that. So the desire for law and order makes democratic societies predisposed to be willing to give quite extensive powers to government in the name of law and order. And just think about the expansion of governmental power after 9/11, sort of the way in which the powers of government were expanded in order to deal with the perceived threat of terrorism. Think about the way that local and state and federal governmental powers are being expanded right now in dealing with COVID-19. Right, so the desire for security and for law and order will make democratic people willing to give extensive powers to the government. So individualism and the desire for law and order both lead to the creation of powerful governments. And there's also the fact, as he mentions on page 302, that people in democratic societies recognize that individually they are, quite weak, and at times, will be in need of help, and they need to look to somewhere for that help. And the natural place to look, he thinks, in a democratic society is to the government, not to your fellow citizens. They're supposed to be your equals, right? Nobody wants to go to their neighbor for a charity handout. When you're in trouble, the place you're going to look is to the government for help. And again, just think of like the stimulus package that was passed a few weeks ago, and there will probably be more of those, that the country, right now, and, I think for the foreseeable future, there's going to be some serious economic hardship for a large number of Americans. And the natural tendency at that point is to turn to the authorities, to turn to the government to find that added help, so that over time people expect more from the government. And as you know, it's just simply the fact of government surviving will tend to cause its duties to expand. That the longer governments last, the more kind of obligations and duties and expectations get attached to it. So just the natural tendency of government over time is to expand its scope. So the need for security, the need for law and order, and individualism, all of these things within democratic societies predispose the population to expect the government to do a lot. So democratic equality naturally tends towards people wanting to have a centralized government The need for personal security, law and order, and individualism naturally tend to make people want to expand the scope of governmental responsibilities. And so when you put those two things together, you can see how the natural tendency of democratic society is towards an increasingly centralized government that has an ever expanding scope of responsibilities that private citizens rely upon for their own livelihood. And so this is how he sort of summarizes things on page 104. Thus, I have arrived by two different paths at the same point. I have shown that equality suggests to men the idea of a unitary, uniform, and strong government. I have now shown that it gives them the taste for it. It is therefore toward a government of this kind that the nations of our day are tending. The natural inclination of their minds and their hearts leads them to it, and it is sufficient that they not hold themselves back in order for them to arrive there. I think that in the democratic times that are going to unfold, individual independence and local liberties will always be a product of art. Centralization will be the natural government. So his tendency towards a centralized and expansive government. Now, how this leads to despotism and what can be done to prevent it will be the subject of the next lecture.